It is my pleasure to introduce John as an old colleague and a dear friend and one of my favorite people. John is from Defenders of Wildlife. He serves as a Rocky Mountains and Great Plains representative. He joined Defenders of Wildlife in 2019 to help deliver an electoral victory to reintroduce wolves to Colorado by 2023. He brings with him experiences in education and advocacy, as well as animal husbandry, including work to rehabilitate and release injured and orphaned wildlife. Past experience with the return of wolves to California instilled in him a powerful lesson on the values of wolf-livestock coexistence, which he now uses in his work with ranchers to promote the partnerships necessary for broader wildlife recovery. I've had the pleasure of working with John and being in community with him, and I am eternally proud of the work he has done for wolves in Colorado, on the front lines with ranchers and farmers, and having the difficult conversations. John, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you to speak for wolves in general. It's great to be back, and looking forward to one of these days when we can do this in person. As I'm sure many of us are eager for that day. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and try to get the share screen going. All right. So what I'm hoping to do for us today is just kind of go over some general updates on how things are going in Colorado, talk a little bit about our reintroduction plan and what is sort of the next steps ahead of us. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A and we can dig a little bit deeper. There we go. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just a very brief overview, talk about who Defenders is, a little bit of history of wolves in Colorado, and then I'll also provide some updates. This includes things on the stakeholder advisory group, the technical work group, and the involvement of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And finally, I'll end with a little bit of a very high level discussion of kind of what we mean when we say coexistence. But before we do continue, I do want to take just a quick moment to acknowledge that regardless of where you're joining us tonight, it is Indigenous persons who were the original stewards of land, water, and wildlife. As we continue to advance our ecological goals, we must also acknowledge the role that conservation movement has played to displace and disenfranchise Indigenous Americans and work to repair what centuries of abuse have destroyed. All right. Let's jump into this a little bit. Who is Defenders of Wildlife? Well, if you're not familiar with us, Defenders of Wildlife is an organization that is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. Originally set up as the Defender of Fur Bearers, we're a national conservation organization that's focused on protecting and preserving threatened and endangered species in North America. So the conservation vision, of course, includes really those networks, creating broader networks. So it's not always as species focused as it used to be, getting a little bit more into a broader understanding, I think, of the interconnectivity of ecoregions and ecosystems. But of course, Defenders has been involved in wolf conservation for a long time. Defenders was involved in the reintroductions of the mid-90s and most wolf work across the country, though I would say we haven't played much of a role in the Great Lakes states. Reasons for really wanting wolves recovered. I mean, I shouldn't have to tell this audience, but I'll go through what's on the slide all the same. The idea, of course, is to restore the natural balance. That's really the simplest way to say it for a very broad audience. Of course, we can get into the real nitty gritty on here, but typically what that looks like is returning a keystone predator, returning that keystone role to allow the ecosystem all these various niches and nuances that we may not always be entirely aware of are based on species playing that vital ecological role. So we want all those species to be intact and playing that role, not just the wolves, but we want a healthy balance of prey and predator populations. And I think quite naturally, we also want to find a way that we humans can be a part of that mix as well. It's just a quick little review. As I mentioned, these are just some of the different field offices we have across the country where we are doing work on wolves. In the lower left corner there, you can see the previous president of Defenders, with the 1995 reintroduction. And you can see our current president in the lower right corner. That's at the Mexican wolf reintroduction in 1998. But let's talk a little bit about Colorado. Historically, as I imagine most of us know, throughout North America, we had up to about 2 million wolves living in what would be considered a relatively balanced and healthy ecosystem. But with the colonization of the colonies, with the arrival of European settlers and European culture, we quickly saw a bounty being placed on wolves. The first government bounty was actually in 1869. I believe that was in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that kicked off about a century of predator eradication. For Colorado, that meant the last wolf was killed in 1943. It's the last record of a wolf in Colorado until recently. 30 years later, of course, we finally started figuring things out. We got the Endangered Species Act passed. We got the EPA put into creation. We started caring a little bit about conservation. In the 1980s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service starts to think about a wolf reintroduction, and they complete the Northern Rockies Wolf Plan. Now, in the following years, there had been discussion about potential wolf reintroductions in the Southern Rockies, meaning a place like Colorado, but the then Department of Wildlife in Colorado, the commission, passed on 2 occasions in 82 and 89. So just to quickly bring you up to speed, we basically had a history of trying to get wolf reintroduction through various channels and not having a lot of success, despite a strong ecological need for wolves and robust support from the general population in Colorado. As a result, in 2020, we put together a ballot campaign, and we took Proposition 114 to the voters, and we voted to reintroduce wolves. Now, shortly before that happened in 2019, a wolf appeared in Jackson County, that's just on the southern end of the Wyoming-Colorado border. I will tell you a little bit more about that wolf as we go. I'll talk about him a little bit right here, talk about her. So this is the history of wolves that we have had in Colorado. You can see the first real arrival was in 2004 when the wolf came all the way down onto Highway I-70 right near Idaho Springs. It's just west of Denver, and was unfortunately hit by a car. We've had a couple trickles of wolves here and there since then, really kind of opportunistic wolves that happen to have found a way into Colorado, but unfortunately they never found a mate. And so they would either die in Colorado or perhaps turn around and not be seen or heard from again. Hopefully returning back to a place where there are other wolves. Well, in 2019, though, we did have a wolf that showed up in Colorado. That was a wolf that had been collared from the Snake River Pack in Yellowstone and was given the designation 1084M, M for male. Well, that threw us for a loop when the following year we saw another wolf with 1084M who also was identified as a male. Not completely unheard of, but once we found pups, that's when we really started asking questions. Sure enough, there was a clerical error when 1084 was first kind of reviewed or looked at by veterinary technicians, and was marked down as a male when she was in fact a female. So that created Colorado's current only pack. This is a pack that's living just in the Walden area in Jackson County. It is a pack that may be as many as 8, though the wolves in this pack do not have working radio collars. So most reports at this point are visual observations that are being reported in. We are not aware if there's been pup production this year, though it seems that there has not been. And we're not sure if we have all 8 members of the pack or if there's some fragment therein of. Talk a little bit, though, about our favorite wolf myths. Again, this should be a review for, I imagine, most of us, but we often hear that, well, we can't have wolves because they'll decimate elk numbers. But of course, the reality is in all northern Rocky Mountain states, we have more populous herds of elk today than before wolves were reintroduced. The other common refrain is that wolves will cripple the livestock industry, when all data seems to suggest that wolves account for fewer than 0.1% loss for cattle. So it's not to say that those losses don't matter, but they are rare. Just taking a quick look, some numbers here on the elk populations in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. Now, in full concession, we're simplifying things to just draw these 2 data points and make a correlation. There's a lot that goes into this. This isn't necessarily looking at the different regions or management units, but I think this does give a kind of 30,000-foot view that indicates that by most measures here, the elk populations are doing very well. In fact, we have, I think Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks is calling it the decade of the elk, and Idaho Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been calling it the second golden age of elk. And why do we want wolves and not human hunters? Well, it's not to say that we don't necessarily want human hunters. They can play a role when hunting prey for meat. However, wolves and humans play a very different role in their selection pressure. Humans, of course, well, we're looking for meat. We may be looking for hide. We may be looking for some sort of trophy. Wolves, they're looking for what's easy to catch. Because when you have to catch your meals with your teeth, you're going to look for ways to kind of cut some corners. As a result, wolves are selecting for elk that are significantly older and in significantly poorer body condition. By doing that, they remove some of those weak genetics from the population, allowing the herd to, over time, actually improve its strength and its virility. Here's just a quick look when we're talking about livestock. This is a look at Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming in 2015. 2015 is the year we chose here because that's the last year that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service produced a comprehensive report for all three areas. You can work at putting some of this together nowadays. It's just a little tougher because each state kind of has different metrics that they're using, so it's hard to really put them all together. But each dot here represents a wolf pack. So what we've done is if a wolf pack's in that county, we count the cattle population and the wolves. This way, we're not counting places where wolves and cattle do not overlap. And within this range, we found a loss rate to wolves in the year 2015 of 0.009%. So statistically, very few. And that's just to say wolves are not going to decimate elk numbers or the livestock industry. But of course, that's not to say they won't have an impact. Just a quick look here. Here's just an idea of what these losses look like. These are losses that were attributed to wolves. Now, of course, you'll have confirmed losses that some sort of third-party investigator has confirmed. And then you'll also have self-reported losses, which do not require any confirmation. And you'll see a lot of variation between those numbers naturally. I tend to say, look at both sets of numbers. The reality is likely somewhere in between. Just another quick look. I'll leave this on the screen for a moment in case anybody wants to screen capture that or take a quick study of what this looks like. Naturally, you can see sheep losses tend to be much higher than cattle losses. Sheep are just a significantly easier animal to take. And as you may have heard, in some cases, a surplus killing, we can end up with a lot of sheep panicking and leading to more losses. Okay. Here's where I want to get to. That's the why. That's kind of the why we wanted to reintroduce wolves to Colorado. But let's talk a little bit about how we're going to reintroduce the wolves to Colorado. First, it's through the law that Proposition 114 created, which is State Statute 33-2-105.8. And you can see the exact language of that law right here. I'll just draw attention to the main points. We are going to do reintroduction by December 31st, 2023, which means we've only got about a year left in our timeline. In addition, wolves will be reintroduced on the western slope of Colorado, and compensation is required, meaning if a wolf is found to have been the cause of livestock loss, the state is obligated to pay some kind of compensation for that loss. Some legislative updates that we've had guiding the process. We had co-sponsors Perry Will and Jenny Arndt that worked together to create kind of an interesting law. House Bill 21-1243 made it so that no hunting revenues can be used to fund the reintroduction. Now, this was largely because we heard from the sportspersons community that they did not want their hunting license revenues going to this effort. And we felt, well, we've got a lot of places where we can secure funding for this. There are plenty of ways to do it. This seems like a good thing to do. We went ahead and worked together, identified about $800,000 in existing money that could be used, and otherwise prohibited the use of any recreational hunting revenues. In 2021, that same year, we then were able to go to the general fund and seek and secure $1.1 million of annual funding for wolf reintroduction. And just this past year, we were able to increase that funding to $2.1 million a year. So between that $2.1 million a year, the $800,000 that was secured from the previous bill, we are, what I believe, in pretty good shape for the funding here in Colorado. Of course, there are other opportunities we could look at. Colorado has a lottery system that funds a lot of conservation work. And we've all got our eyes on the RAWA, Rewilding America's Wildlife Act, which can bring a windfall of funding to states if it passes through the Senate. The state otherwise hired a third-party facilitator called the Keystone Policy Center, and they put together two different advisory groups. The point of these advisory groups is basically to create a set of recommendations to give to the state to draft the management plan. The stakeholder advisory group are basically stakeholders. These are folks like sports persons. They are folks like ranchers. They are, I think, even include a county commissioner. They otherwise involve a lot of non-consumptive users. Defenders of Wildlife is represented on the stakeholder advisory group, as are a few other conservation groups. The idea is to bring some of these social stakeholders together to talk about some of the social impacts of a wolf reintroduction. You can see here the schedule of events. They've got one meeting left. It's coming up next week or so. And after that, they will deliver their final recommendations. And we should see a draft plan here at the end of the year. Just a quick little description here. The technical work group, the idea of that is typically wolf biologists, agency representatives, might be from Fish and Wildlife Service, or state wildlife game agencies. And they've largely gotten together to discuss some of the technical aspects of a reintroduction. You can see some of those specified here on the screen. So I want to let you know how you can follow up on this. The website for the Keystone Policy Center is wolfengagementco.org. You can see it there at the top of the search bar. And if you want to find the reports that these advisory groups are putting out, you want to click that advisory group button right there at the top. That'll bring you to a page that looks like this. And on the right-hand side of your screen, under reports and documents, you'll be able to click on that and get all the downloads of the different reports that these two groups have put out. This is informative because it gives us a really good idea of where the discussion's going, what the draft plan is likely to consider. Of course, these groups are just advisory. So the Parks and Wildlife Commission does have the discretion to completely ignore it, though I don't foresee that happening, but it would technically be permissible because these are advisory groups. Speaking of the commission, that's a really important note because those are the ones who are actually going to make the decision. What's going to happen is the Parks and Wildlife Agency is going to create a draft plan, but it's the Parks and Wildlife Commission that's going to confirm and approve that plan. So right now on the screen, I'm showing the current schedule for this year, and we have a rough idea of some dates for next year I've included at the bottom of the screen here. This is particularly important because, like I've been mentioning, come December, we're going to have a draft plan. Well, January, February, that's when we're going to be having discussion at the commission. That's when we really need folks to turn up, to register, to provide comments at these meetings. You can do so virtually or in person, and really make sure that what we're going to have approved is a wolf reintroduction plan that considers the best available science and really sets us forward as a leader. Quick note on our commissioners, here they are. Colorado has an 11-person commission. The commissioners are by statute required to represent the different kind of ideologies you see here, ranging from outdoor recreation to agriculture to sports persons and some at-large seats. You'll notice there is absolutely no requirement for anybody with a biological science background. That is true of the vast majority of our commissions across this country. I think it's a really interesting thing for us to be aware of and consider what we can do to improve the makeup of our commissions because these folks actually have an enormous amount of influence on wildlife decisions. We do have two new commissioners coming in, Richard Reading and Gabriel Otero. Neither have yet been confirmed by Colorado Senate, but they are still allowed to act and vote even prior to confirmation. So things were bumping along in Colorado. We were talking about a Colorado plan, and then, well, I would say something good happened, though it certainly gave us a monkey wrench, a little bit of a curveball for Colorado. And that's the relisting of wolves. So I'm sure we were all familiar. One of the final acts of Trump's Department of the Interior was to delist the gray wolf. And then in February of this year, they were nationally put back on the endangered species list, with the exception of that carved out population in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and parts of eastern Oregon, Washington, and Utah. Otherwise, wolves now have their full federal protections again in all other parts of the lower 48. That means here in Colorado, Colorado Parks and Wildlife technically no longer has the authority to reintroduce the wolves. It now goes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So what does this mean for us? Like I said, this is a little bit of a curveball, but not entirely, because we sure hoped this would happen. We were very hopeful that we would have federal relisting. We just knew it was going to make things somewhat interesting. And indeed it has. You may have been noticing, and thank you to the organizers. I loved the little slide we had going around telling everybody about the scoping period that's currently open in Colorado. I'm going to talk very briefly and try to avoid getting too into the weeds. But Colorado Parks and Wildlife has requested a Section 10J rule for the reintroduction. So Fish and Wildlife Service on July 21st announced that they're accepting comments on a scoping period for the environmental impact survey that they're going to conduct. Basically, what they're asking for is they're saying, hey, what should we be looking at? What are things that we should be considering? What are some things we might not be thinking about that we need to make sure we address in this plan? Well, Colorado Parks and Wildlife requested a 10J. What that specifically means, in the simplest terms, is that wolves will be managed not as an endangered species, but as a threatened species. There's some nuances in here between experimental population and an essential versus non-essential population. What I'll quickly say on that, experimental typically means, is this population, actually kind of, experimental and essential, non-essential gets a little murky. Essential versus non-essential would basically mean, is this species necessary to the survival of the species? For example, would having gray wolves in Colorado be necessary for the survival of gray wolves? As much as I would like to say it is, I would imagine most would argue no. However, that argument is probably very different from Mexican gray wolves, despite the fact that the service has not listed that population as essential either. This current comment period is open till August 22nd. You can submit those comments at regulations.gov. I've got the docket ID number there at the top of the screen that you may have also grabbed it from that slide that I mentioned that the organizers have play in between presentations here. And these are just a couple of rough comments that I am making, that I am interested in seeing made. If this is helpful for you, please, by all means. But one particular thing, two particular things I want to make sure is, one, that wolves are allowed to live without boundaries. This is specific language from Colorado's 2004 management plan for wolves that said wolves can live wherever they find habitat as long as they're not getting into trouble, as long as they're not causing significant problems. And I think that should continue to be the case here. In addition, I think we need to really be considerate of Mexican gray wolves and even other gray wolf subspecies that may one day find themselves in Colorado. And I think that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should allow any mixing of gray wolf subspecies, that Colorado should be a state of mixture. And that would therefore allow us a little bit of a slowing of that genetic gradation into the Mexican wolf experimental population area in both Arizona and New Mexico. Finally, though this, I would say, is not necessarily what the service is looking for with their scoping periods, but I think it is worth saying frequently, recovery should not be determined by a population number. Recovery should be determined by several criteria, which include self-sustaining populations, which are widely geographically distributed, who have restored connectivity across the Rockies, particularly from Wyoming to New Mexico. And we want the wolves in population densities high enough that they can actually play their ecological role. Just a quick note on the Mexican wolf. This is the Mexican wolf experimental population area. This is their 10J. The 10J for the Mexican gray wolf established a very specific geographic boundary. That is something 10Js do. One particular trouble we've had with this boundary, however, is that the service has not allowed wolves to migrate north of Interstate 40. And that's been a big issue because it's limited their expansion. It's limited their ability to find new habitat and new range. And it has also limited that genetic corridor. So while I think we do want to preserve the genetic integrity of the Mexican gray wolf, which is listed as a unique subspecies, I think that the bottlenecking that population's undergone is also a good reason to restore corridors that allow gray wolves to wander and exchange those genetics. All right, I'm going to talk just a little bit here briefly about coexistence, what I kind of mean when I say that, and offer a few examples, and maybe then we'll get to the end. We'll have some question time. But coexistence, I mean, this word can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and in fact, that's one of the challenges to, well, I suppose, the marketing for this term, is it evokes a lot of different thoughts for a lot of different people. What I would say I mean by coexistence is simply a way to share the land. And this means that I recognize that we have a lot of livestock production on the land, and those may not be my values. My values may be healthy, robust wildlife and big open areas that wildlife can live in. But coexistence means sharing those values. My values don't need to dictate yours and vice versa. So the idea of coexistence is, well, how can we get together to find a way that we can have humans, livestock, and wildlife all on the landscape together, and do so in a way that we can really minimize those negative aspects. So this really looks like a suite of different non-lethal tools and techniques that we implement on the rangelands to really reduce the risk of predation or predator damages. And I do have to say, we often fall into the pitfall of thinking that this is very easy, that all you need to do is get some guardian dogs or put up some flags and the problem will be solved. The reality is this is often really big, open, rugged terrain that's really hard to cover. The solutions that we provide, they work some of the time and in specific cases. And so it takes a lot of customization, a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of work to eventually figure out what's going to work for that operation. So here's one of those examples is fladry. The idea of fladry is a polywire that can be electrified. We have these red strips of fabric that hang down over it, and you can use this to create a barrier. Now, I've often had people say, well, why do you use red? Wolves can't see red. Use a different color. I'd invite you to go write a paper on it. It'd be very interesting. They just use red. That's just kind of what's been used. I don't think anybody's found any particular color to be more effective than another. The idea, well, I will also say nobody really knows exactly why it works. One idea, one thought, is that the movement of these flags creates a changing stimulus for the wolves. And wolves are neophobic, which means they're afraid of new things. So when they see this barrier all of a sudden that comes up and it's moving, they say, well, maybe I'm going to give that a little distance. I don't know what that is. I'm going to kind of avoid it. But eventually they figure out that's just some flags. And eventually they will break the flager, which means they'll go across it. It will no longer be an effective barrier. And that's why this works in really limited capacities, about 6 to 8 weeks that you would want to use fladry. So it becomes a very acute situational tool. One of my favorite tools, of course, is trail cameras. One, because you get all of these really cool videos, not just of wolves, but all sorts of animals that might be on your property. But it is really valuable to learn the movements and the behaviors of wildlife on your property. Getting this idea of when do they come by? Is it on a regular basis? Well, if the wolves come by every 12 days and they always come to the same spot, maybe we can put, again, an acute tool in that spot every 12 days to make sure that we're prepared. Oh, yeah, we get a little video here. Why not? Some cute pups. I think these are up in Idaho, I believe, these guys. You see at the end, they found the trail camera troublemakers. Carcass management. Carcass management is another important part of coexistence. Oftentimes, dead stock may be put in a bone pile. They may be left out where they die. In many cases, we actually don't even know that the animal has died, particularly if the animal's turned out on a public grazing allotment at the time. But this is really important because if we do not get rid of those carcasses, if we're not managing those carcasses, we're attracting scavengers. And yes, that is bears and wolves. A wolf doesn't care if the meat is fresh. I mean, meat is hard to get. Meat is meat. If it's edible, you know, why take the risk? Why go out on the hunt when I got a free meal right there? That can draw the animals into a ranching operation where other issues could present themselves. So it's often just a very good idea to do carcass management. However, I will say easier said than done. As you can imagine, trying to recover a 600-pound carcass out in the middle of nowhere, you got nothing but maybe a horse. It can be very tricky. The range riders are a huge component of this work. I think range riders are phenomenally important. But range riders, again, is a term that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people, I think, just think of cowboys and think it's a matter of running around and chasing your cows and hooting and hollering. I'd say it's really actually about low-stress livestock handling. It's about keeping an eye on the herd, looking out for predators, but you're also looking after the herd to make sure they're not getting lost, that calves are staying with their mother cows, that injuries are being addressed. It reduces stress. A good range rider has also got a good idea of grazing management and how to make sure that they're not overgrazing. By having this active role, you can keep an eye out when carcasses appear. It really allows you to engage all of the other tools by having that individual on the landscape who's not only providing human presence, but is really creating that human element to study and understand the landscape. Finally, resiliency. This one is actually all on the livestock themselves. What I often say, and these pictures demonstrate, think about how bison interact with wolves. Oftentimes when they feel threatened or they feel that there's a predation that's about to happen, the bison will circle up and they will stand their ground. And all of a sudden, the wolf starts redoing the math and might think, well, you know what? This is too risky. I could get seriously injured or killed on the hunt. I'm going to wait till I have a better opportunity. If we're able to reinstill some of that resiliency into our domestic cattle, which we've largely bred out over generations, that's one of the most effective ways to actually reduce livestock losses. In simple terms, when the cows defend themselves, when they stand up for themselves, that can really shift the calculus on how these interactions go. So I hope I left some time here. I'm not sure how we did, but that's the end for me. I got a couple names up here I want to point out. Obviously myself, I mostly do wolf work here in Colorado and Wyoming. My counterpart Eric's up in Idaho and Montana. So if you want to get in touch with him, and Caitlin there is our national outreach representative for the region. So if you want to get engaged, become one of our packtivists or anything like that, definitely reach out to Caitlin. You want to chat wolves, Eric and I are more than happy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. We do have quite a bit of questions, so I'm just going to get started.
All right.
So both Michigan and this is from an anonymous attendee. Both Michigan and Minnesota have non-lethal specialists employed by the USDA Wildlife Services working directly with producers proactively. Has Colorado considered such a position? And I start off with this one because there has been a lot of progress made on this and hoping you can speak to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, as we know, as Sunny certainly spelled out for us, Wildlife Service has got a dark history. They're responsible for the death of more wildlife than any other agency, group, or identity. But something that Defenders of Wildlife and the National Resources Defense Council have worked hard on over the last few years is increasing the funding for non-lethal positions, meaning agents who cannot, under any circumstances, do lethal control. And a lot of that was somewhat pioneered by work in Montana. And just recently, Colorado Parks and Wildlife actually made a hire, kind of sniped that position out of Wildlife Services, and brought Adam Baca to Colorado to be our non-lethal. Well, I take that back. He's to be the state Colorado Parks and Wildlife conflict specialist. Right now, that's a non-lethal situation because wolves have full federal protection, and we don't have a 10J, though I imagine that's not long-term a non-lethal position, but it is a non-lethal priority, I would say.
Awesome, John. And spurring off of that question, can you give us an insight on what the schedule for the 10J would look like and how that butts up right against the December 2023 deadline for paws on the ground?
Yes, they are going to take us very close. And I do want to highlight this because there's a potential risk in here. So the 10J, normally to do an EIS and NEPA and do all this work can take months, years. It could be a very lengthy process. Colorado and Fish and Wildlife Services are hoping to be very fast this time. And they're hoping to complete that about 2 weeks before the mandate says we have to reintroduce wolves. So, we are fully committed to meeting that mandate, but it is cutting it close. It's bringing it close. And what I would say we're a little bit anxious of are anything that can cause delays in there, anything that makes us miss that December 31st, 2023 deadline. And so we just want to be very mindful of that as we're going forward, as we're advocating or we're submitting our comments. We want to make sure that the most important thing is that we meet that deadline.
Thank you for that clarification, John. This one is from KB. Can you explain further your view? And it might not be your view, it could be the view of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, that this population is not essential to survival when these wolves being protected would hopefully allow for the supply of genetic diversity and dispersing animals into naked wolf range.
Yeah, I mean, the position there is that Fish and Wildlife Service tends to have some very kind of static, unmovable definitions for some of this stuff, and how they would define essential would mean if that population disappeared, would the species go extinct? And so in this case, I don't think we could make that argument because we do have wolves throughout the rest of the country. So it'd be hard to say that their existence in Colorado is necessary for their survival as a species. Again, I do think that we could make that argument for red wolves and Mexican gray wolves. But that's a different listing.
John, tell me why are we considering in Colorado the reintroduction of Mexican wolves?
We largely are not, but I would not stop anybody from advocating for it. I would love to see it on a personal level. What I will say is that there's been a lot of talk in Colorado about Mexican gray wolves. In 2016, the commission passed a resolution opposing the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolves. And then Governor John Hickenlooper also joined the governors of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah in basically signing a Four Corners agreement opposing the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolves. There's also been a lot of conversation about the historic range of Mexican gray wolves, and many have suggested they didn't historically live in Colorado. Though I would point out that, if the Mexican wolf had never been extirpated, I think between human pressure and climate change, wolves may have that population may have naturally migrated into Colorado because it does provide habitat. So this is something I think we're going to see more and more. This argument about historic range versus the impacts of climate change. This is something that is totally appropriate to talk about in the scoping period, to talk about the impacts of climate change and how the service should be anticipating those impacts.
Thanks for that, John. There's so many questions still, so I'm gonna keep going until 30. And this one is from Shuri Lynn. And I'll read it in her voice. I'm a Colorado resident, former environmental scientist, and international K through 12 professional development leader for teachers. I've attended 2 Colorado Wolf meetings, submitted comments to both the federal and state websites. I also spoke with Keystone, was a bit disappointed with my conversations with USFS and CPW. 2 questions. What else can I do now besides comment on the draft plan? And 2, I'd like to educate Colorado kids on this process. Is anyone working on something like that?
You know, I have not checked in a little while, but during the campaign, there was a great program by the Captain Planet Foundation. They collected a lot of interviews and they did some lesson plans on wolf reintroduction. I want to say this was largely geared at maybe 5th grade through 8th grade level. I am certain those resources are still up there, though I haven't been in touch to know how they've been updated since the reintroduction. But I definitely encourage that. Also, the International Wolf Center has got a great list of kind of curricula and lesson plans and stuff that you can do to engage kids with a lot of kind of wolf lessons in ecology. And for that matter, I'd encourage you to get in touch with any of your local wolf sanctuaries. We've got several here in Colorado. Of course, the Colorado Wolf and Wildlife Center, Darlene Kabobel is a member of the stakeholder advisory group as well. She's got a great center in Divide where you can go and probably find, you know, lots of ways to work school education with their education staff. Otherwise, I would say in terms of the advocacy, the commission, you know, we've been, these past 15 months, we've been working with a bunch of volunteers, really. You know, the stakeholder advisory group, they don't actually have power. It's the commissioners who have power. And so I think it's time to really start having conversations with the commissioners, making sure that they really understand our position, where we're coming from, that we're not just being crazy wolf people, that we actually have a legitimate argument and vision and idea of how we're going to get there. So I think that's the work we really need to be focusing on. And I imagine there will be a lot of talking points from the various groups. You know, we've all continued to stay in really good coordination and touch, even after the campaign, a lot of different Colorado groups that worked on the reintroduction. So there'll be nuances of difference between our talking points, I imagine, but you'll see a lot of consistency.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Tell us a little bit about the narratives that you're seeing in Colorado and what's being done to change some of the attitudes of anti-wolf people.
Yeah, you know, so there's a narrative that we have right now. That one pack that I mentioned that's up in North Park, Colorado, they've been implicated in several depredation incidents. The first happened right after Christmas. And then we had another in January, and I believe another in February. By May, we had our range riders hired and put out in position. And I would say from at least everything I've heard, we've not had any incidents since then. But this has created a lot of excitement and a lot of attention. It's really put a spotlight on Colorado. Everybody wants to talk about it. The media, I say, sometimes won't quit. And it definitely creates this impression that, boy, the wolves are killing a cow every day. They're out there every week causing, you know, the sky has fallen. You know, the damages have been concerning. It's certainly not what we want. We don't want this to happen. But this narrative has come out that Colorado is behind. And I would challenge that narrative. One place where that narrative is coming from is a lot of times when folks say Colorado is behind, they mean we can't kill the wolves. That is not Colorado's decision right now. They are endangered at both the state and federal level. So it's not a topic for discussion as far as I'm concerned. The conversations I'm having with ranchers and sports persons groups, we were not having conversations anywhere near this close to the reintroduction of the Northern Rockies. It took years in some cases to get to this point. So I really think Colorado is ahead. I think we've also, the stakeholder advisory group, one particular development I was really pleased with is they effectively stopped the conversation of a recreational wolf hunt. Let's not have this conversation. The time is not now. We're not going to get into population targets. Colorado voters specifically voted for wolves to be a non-game species, meaning our choice was that they can't be hunted. I think that's really good. I don't think other states were really willing to go there and have that conversation. Now, not everything's perfect. I would say the pro-wolf community isn't going to get everything that we want out of this reintroduction, but I think we're going to get more than we've gotten in our past efforts.